Ever feel like you need like a PhD to wrap your head around certain topics? Today, we're going deep on one that definitely fits the bill. How the Quran deals with what's halal, haram, and that kind of gray area, Muharram.
Yeah, and we're not just like defining terms here. We're going straight to the source, digging into this, what's it called? The Quranic traffic light of halal, lawful, haram, sacred, and Muharram, unlawful. Really trying to get the WHY behind these categories, you know?
Because just knowing something's forbidden doesn't really tell you much, does it? We want to uncover the logic, the whole cultural context, those aha moments that make these ancient texts relevant to, well, us today.
Totally. And one thing our source really emphasizes is this idea of God's word being unchanging, eternal. You see this pop up in both the Quran and the Bible, actually. Kind of sets the stage, don't you think?
So we're playing textual detective, going straight to the Quran itself, relying on its own internal logic rather than relying on, like, traditional interpretations, huh?
Exactly. And just like detectives use clues, we're using this traffic light analogy from the source to, well, shed light on halal, haram, muharram, the whole shebang.
All right, lay it on me. This traffic light analogy, I'm all ears.
So picture this. Green light, that's your halal. Think open road, freedom to move, things generally considered permissible. Most situations, this is where you're at.
Green means go. So halal is like the vast majority of what's considered okay, allowed. What about red then?
Red light, those are the hard stops.
Oh.
Harma, haram, forbidden. No gray area there. And our source points out that the Quran gets pretty darn specific when it comes to red light prohibitions, especially in two areas. Food, for one.
Okay, so we're already beyond just like halal food here. There are different types of forbidden, even when it comes to what you eat.
Exactly. And the second big one, marriage. The Quran lays out some pretty specific no-nos when it comes to who you can and can't marry.
So already way more nuanced than I think a lot of folks realize.
Right. And the interesting thing is, both these areas, food and marriage, they connect back to this idea of purity, of health even, and social order, of course. Like, these rules aren't arbitrary. They're guiding principles for a certain way of life. At least that's how our source seems to be framing it.
That makes sense. It's not just restriction for restriction's sake, but promoting well-being on a bunch of different levels. Which brings us to yellow light, haram. This is where it gets extra interesting. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Haram, see, that's not a straightforward stop or go. It's more like proceed with caution. Understand the rules of the road before you enter that intersection. Our source even suggests this is where a lot of misunderstandings pop up because people try to oversimplify something that requires, well, context. You can't just boil it down. You know?
So it's not that things in this category are necessarily bad, but they come with a different responsibility. They're treated as sacred in some way.
You got it. It's about respecting boundaries, understanding the why behind the caution. Now, before we get into the weeds of haram, those foods and marriages that are definite no from the Quran, those red light areas, I think you'll find some of the specifics kind of surprising.
Hit me with it. What are some of these forbidden feasts, or should I say not feasts, laid out in the Quran?
Well, with food, some are probably what you'd expect. Pork, big no-no.
Right. That's pretty common across several religions, right?
Exactly. But then you get into some of the less obvious ones. Anything found dead from natural causes is out too, like roadkill's right out.
Interesting. No roadkill BBQ, got it. Is that like a hygiene thing, or is there a deeper reason there?
Our source connects it to healthy living. Not just physical health either. It's also about obedience. Like, you're submitting to God's will by eating what's considered permissible. Spiritual health too, right?
So aligning your actions with a certain divinely ordained order, even in something as everyday as what you eat.
Exactly. Another example is anything sacrificed on those stone altars, you know, the ones dedicated to idols. That's a no-go.
Okay, so that one feels less about hygiene and more about drawing a hard line between what's considered idolatry and true worship then.
Exactly. It shows you how much emphasis is placed on intention, purity of worship, really important concepts in Islam.
Okay, so we've got some food for thought, so to speak, on those dietary restrictions. What about marriage? What kind of unions are considered haram in the Quran?
Well, like with the foodstuffs, some are pretty universal. Marrying your mother or daughter strictly off limits.
Right, those are pretty much taboo across the board, I'd say.
For sure. But then you get prohibitions that might surprise you, like marrying two sisters at the same time. Absolutely forbidden.
So it's not just about direct lineage, but keeping family structures harmonious.
Exactly. And this idea of family harmony, it gets even more interesting. There are prohibitions against marrying certain relatives through something called fosterage.
Fosterage. Okay, now you're going to have to explain that one.
So it's like this. If a woman breastfeeds a child, even if they're not biologically related, that creates a family bond. And that bond comes with implications for marriage down the line.
Wow. That's really fascinating. You can see how much weight is given to family connections, even those formed outside of, like, blood ties.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting, while these prohibitions around close relatives are central to the Quran, you see similar ideas in other religious traditions too. Even in the Bible. It kind of speaks to a shared understanding of kinship, how crucial it is to building a strong society.
Makes you realize that even faiths that seem really different on the surface often have a lot of common ground when it comes to ethics, social structures too.
Totally. Now, before we get into all the nuances of haram, there's one more thing we got to touch on about these prohibitions, and it's a bit of a curveball. Our source, they make some pretty bold claims about the locations mentioned in the Quran, specifically the ones connected to these forbidden acts.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. What kind of claims are we talking about here? Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of claims are we talking about?
So our source, they get into some pretty interesting interpretations of certain verses, particularly the ones about a forbidden place or a forbidden house. You know, traditionally, those have always been interpreted as referring to Mecca, right?
Right, Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, home to the Kaaba and all that. So where's the controversy? What's our source suggesting?
They're suggesting those verses might actually be talking about a totally different place. Mecca Petra. It's in Jordan.
Hold up. A different Mecca. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, that goes against, like, centuries of interpretation. What evidence do they even have for that?
So they focus on a few key things. First, they look at that verse in Surah Al-Isra, you know, the one who talks about the Lord of the East and the West. And they're saying that description, like geographically, it doesn't really line up with Mecca and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Mecca's pretty much in the middle of all that, not exactly the Far East.
Exactly. And then they tie that in with another verse, this is Surah Ibrahim, where Abraham talks about, like, settling some of his descendants near a forbidden house, right? And they're proposing this house could be talking about the structures you find in Petra, which, if you think about it, was a major religious center way before Islam came around.
So they're basically piecing together these geographic clues and the historical context, trying to see if a different picture emerges.
Yeah, like a puzzle. And it goes even further. They even suggest that the first house of worship, you know, what's traditionally understood as the Kaaba, they think that might actually refer to a spot in Bakka, Jerusalem, again, linking it back to Abraham and his whole story.
So they're proposing a pretty different take on some very important Islamic narratives, geographically speaking. Definitely makes you think.
Challenging, for sure. And maybe even a little illuminating, right? Like our source, they're not saying they've got definitive proof or anything. But they do make a pretty good case for looking at these verses with fresh eyes. And even if they're not right, it does highlight how we interpret these texts, the human element of it all.
Because interpretations can change as we get new information or ask different questions.
Exactly. It reminds us that engaging with these texts should be a dynamic process. You know, like being open to questioning, considering different points of view, all of that. But putting aside the whole debate about the actual locations for a minute, I think there's a broader takeaway here about how halal, haram, and muharram work together as a system.
It's not just about, like, checking things off a list, right? There's a bigger picture here.
Exactly. Our source seems to be saying that these categories, when you really understand them in context, they offer a framework for ethical living, like a way to navigate the complexities of life while staying true to, you know, divine guidance.
So less about rigid rules, more about understanding the spirit of those rules, the underlying principles.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that whole yellow light area, haram. That's where those principles, that need for nuance and deeper understanding, become really, really important.
All right, let's dive into it. What makes haram so difficult to define, even within the Quran itself? Out of all the categories we've talked about, haram feels the trickiest, you know, like the one that's easiest to misunderstand. So how does the Quran actually deal with this whole idea of what's considered sacred, where it's more about caution than a straight up, don't do this kind of thing?
You're right on the money, and our source makes a big deal about that too. They're saying that a lot of the arguments and conflicts you see, even within Islam, they come from disagreements about what should be considered haram in the first place.
Because there's no list, right? It's more about getting the deeper meaning, the intention behind it all.
Yeah, and that makes it tough. Our source doesn't give, like, a dictionary definition of haram, probably because the Quran itself doesn't really have one. But they do lay out a way to think about it.
All right, I'm all about frameworks. Helps to organize all this. How can we wrap our heads around haram in a way that makes sense?
Okay, so think of it like this. We've got halal, the green light stuff. That's pretty straightforward. Stuff that's generally fine, even encouraged, right? Then you got that red light Muharram. Those are the don't even think about it things that mess with the natural order or go against God, big stuff.
Right. Those seem to make sense, especially when we dug into the why behind them.
Exactly. Haram, though, that's where things get messy. It's not that this stuff is automatically bad or impure on its own. It's more about recognizing that certain things, whether it's actions, objects, even places, they've got a certain, weight to them. Like, there's potential for harm if you don't approach them with the right attitude, the right knowledge, too.
So less about what it is and more about how you approach it. Context is key.
Nailed it. Requires deeper understanding, thinking about the consequences, the ones you can and can't see. Our source seems to be saying this is where true piety comes in. It's not just about avoiding the obvious don'ts, but about moving through the world carefully, wisely,
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It makes you realize this isn't just about, following a rule book. It's about cultivating a way of being.
100%. Cultivating awareness, seeking knowledge, always trying to align yourself with that divine wisdom. It's a journey, not a finish line.
And that feels like a good place to wrap up our deep dive for today. We've gone from those clear-cut do's and don'ts, that halal and haram, Muharram stuff, and even waded into the murkier waters of haram.
And let's not forget that whole Mecca Petra thing, right? Even if we don't have all the answers, it shows how important it is to come to these ancient texts with an open mind, ask questions,
Totally. Interpretations can change. New understandings can pop up when we're brave enough to challenge what we think we know.
And maybe that's the biggest lesson here today. Engaging with sacred texts, the Quran, or any of them, it shouldn't be about blind acceptance, right? But it's not about forcing one single interpretation either. It's about approaching these texts with respect, sure, but with a critical eye too. Letting them challenge us, help us see the world and our place in it a bit differently.
Well said. That balance between faith and reason, holding on to traditions while being open to new interpretations, it's a journey, always searching for deeper meaning, right? Trying to live a good life, a fulfilling one, too. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What parts of your own life could benefit from this kind of approach? Moving beyond right and wrong and really wrestling with those gray areas. Till next time, keep asking those questions, keep looking for answers, and keep on diving deep.